So I'm Zadi Diaz, and I'm here with Arianna Huffington, who's an author, syndicated columnist, and the founder of the Huffington Post. Thank you so much for taking some time
I'm
with
delighted.
us. Yeah, there are a bunch of us in Ireland right now who are viewing this from very diverse backgrounds, who have their own transatlantic experience. Can you talk to us a bit about what your experience has been? What was that first time that you crossed the Atlantic, and why?
Well, I was born in Greece. So the first time I crossed the Atlantic was with something called experimental international living. And I went to Vermont, where we got a debriefing session about America, and then went to York, Pennsylvania, which was my first kind of experience of living in America, living with 4 different families in York, and learning about things like blind dating, when I really thought I was going to go out with somebody who was blind. And when they told me that we're going to a drive-in movie, I was wondering, why are we going to a movie with somebody who's blind? So I had to learn all these things. Then I came to America again to live here in 1980. In between, I lived in England, I went to school in England. So it's a combination, my experience, of moving from Greece to Cambridge, where I got my degree, to London, where I lived for almost 10 years, to New York, and then Houston, Washington, Los Angeles. I've really been a gypsy. So that experience of moving around, of being an outsider, has been something I have actually treasured, because it gives you a sense of perspective. You are in that world, but not entirely of that world. So it's harder to be sort of caught up in the conventional wisdom of the time. You are more likely to be questioning things and looking at them in different ways, which is incredibly helpful.
Right. I was going to ask you, I mean, being from one place and living in another, what the challenges were, especially in a field like yours, media. What have been some of the kind of highlights and lows that you've experienced?
Well, the first challenge for me, of course, was my accent. Not so much in America, but in Britain. Henry Kissinger could never have been Secretary of State in Britain. There was a much greater resistance to anybody who didn't speak the Queen's English. And so that was something which definitely strengthened me as a person, to be able to stand up for yourself and speak at the Cambridge Union, even though you were kind of ridiculed because you spoke differently. When I moved to America, I actually tried to learn to speak in a way that made it very comprehensible, much easier to understand. And I remember I had a dialect coach who would put lifesavers on my tongue to make sure that I could pronounce the long E's differently from the short E's. And the effect it had actually was to paralyze me. I felt that I knew what I was doing wrong, but I didn't really easily know how to fix it. And so at some point, I think she definitely helped me a little bit with some of the vowel sounds, but then I just had to accept that that's how I speak, and accept it as part of my own way of speaking.
Right. Well, you bring up an interesting point. In our communication with each other, what do we need to get on the same page? How can we communicate better with each other across that Atlantic Ocean?
Well, of course, there are separate problems that have occurred now, because America has made certain decisions which are very unpopular across the Atlantic, including going to Iraq. And so the first thing is to be able to distinguish, the American government from the American people, that the American people do not always endorse every decision. And so the spread of anti-Americanism is something which can be mitigated when people come together and they meet each other and they realize that a lot of the preconceptions do not apply to individuals.
Right. That's definitely true. We were having a discussion when we first met in Berlin, especially among Europeans, how there's communication barriers there as well. So do you feel that there is a possibility for us to come together and kind of see things in a similar way and be on the same page? How difficult do you think it will be?
Well, part of what I think we need to celebrate is the debate. I don't think we need to force ourselves into agreeing, but listening to each other. I think learning to listen and learning to speak up even when others disagree with us. I think it's this process that is incredibly valuable, even if we don't end up in the same place. You know, shoehorning our views isn't going to be helpful. So I think it's the combination of listening and speaking out that is so valuable.
That's a great, great advice. I mean, there are a lot of us out here who come from different backgrounds, have different skill sets, are trying to come together to work on and focus on an issue. What, in your mind, would you like to see young adults working on that would be of the most importance in a time like it is now?
I really think that right now we're experiencing that in a particularly intense way in America with the collapse of major financial institutions. We need to focus on the growing inequalities, both within nations and among nations. Even if we really didn't care for people, we must realize that it is incredibly destabilizing to have such massive inequalities. When people begin to feel that we're not playing by the same rules. When we're hearing, for example, that certain institutions were too big to fail, but if you're just an ordinary homeowner, tough luck if your house is foreclosed. That gives a sense of injustice, and that is ultimately not just inherently wrong, but also destabilizing and feeding the worst, most dangerous tendencies in our world.
I want to thank you again so much for taking time. I know that you have a very busy schedule, and we really appreciate it. All of us in Ireland right now watching. You know, it's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much, and have a great time in Ireland. I definitely wish I was with you. I love it there.
Thanks a lot.